Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
A truly wild weekend on the campaign trail. And that continues today. Donald Trump in Greenville, North Carolina. We're going to bring you to North Carolina in a moment. Kamala Harris with events throughout Pennsylvania, Malvern, on to Birmingham, Michigan, Brookfield, Wisconsin. We're serious about these swing states. Tim Walz on The View this morning. Did you see him talking to Whoopi Goldberg? That, I'm guessing, will make some news a little bit later on. He's going to be taking part in a reception this evening on his big visit to New York and doing the Daily Show later. Over the weekend, though, boy, what am I not supposed to talk about today? I think is my deliberation. Not to talk about Donald Trump using expletives to describe the vice president or the former president's describing of Arnold Palmer in the shower. Maybe the fact that they closed the McDonald's that he appeared at for the photo op yesterday. They did have to rehearse that whole thing, as apparently the customers were screened by Secret Service. Or we can look forward on what will happen in the next 15 days. That is what Josh Wingrove is talking about. Harris-Trump scrap for few undecided voters as race tightens. My favorite line in the story refers to this as a jump ball election, and that's where we start our conversation with the great Josh Wingrove, Bloomberg White House reporter with us at the table. It's been far too long. Good to see you.
Happy to be here.
If this is a jump ball, then the campaign that scores last wins.
Yeah.
How do you score last? Is it who lands the last big interview? Who says the most outrageous thing? This is tied, Josh.
Well, if you're Harris, you think you do it by peeling off just a little bit of a few groups, like Republicans, for instance, which is why she's touring the 3 blue wall states with Liz Cheney today, and other groups, including whether young voters will turn out, whether they can sort of run up the score with women, whether they can stop some bleeding among Black and Latino voters, Black men in particular.
Yep.
All of that is across the board. One thing, though, in this story, I was with her last week in the Blue Wall. Today is, I believe, the 8th or 9th day in a row she's setting foot in one of those 3 states. So I think, you know, if you'd go by where her feet are, they're seeing their path run through Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And the governors there are striking an upbeat tone. Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania told me flatly Harris will win the state. If she does, I think there's a very good chance she wins the presidency. Sure. Others, of course, less sure. The polls are pretty mixed. To a lesser extent, Governor Evers of Wisconsin, Governor Whitmer of Michigan, signaling kind of similar optimism. Whitmer saying she'd rather have Democrats' hand than the Republicans' hand. So
they're supposed to say that, though, right?
They are, but they haven't necessarily been. Shapiro has been less upbeat. So I guess that jumped out to me. I don't know. I don't know whether I was expecting dour faces and clouds over the skies, but it looks like Democrats are, I suppose there's 2 ways of looking at it. You could say that they are trying to shore up an inside lane. These are usually blue states. Trump won them in 16, but Biden won them in 20. They all have Democratic governors. Or you could say, gee, it looks like she's playing defense here in the last couple of weeks.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it is an odd scenario to have 2 kind of wide open weeks with no debate. Normally we'd be having a debate around the end of this week or next. So what's the culminating event, or does this campaign kind of fizzle out, knowing a lot of people have already started voting? That's
right. And I think we're seeing that in modern elections, so much of this is just a turnout game and a online data
back to the
engagement
jump ball.
Game. That's right.
It's a jump ball in turnout.
So Harris is going to do her town hall, which was nominally supposed to be a debate at one point.
This is on CNN
this week, so we'll be watching that, of course, very closely. And Trump has announced, for instance, other events, including Madison Square Garden and a big shindig
so what do you
in
make
New
of
York.
That, by the way? Is there some logic to it? It's going to be big pictures. Look, he's like Led Zeppelin up there on stage at Madison Square Garden. Or is it a true waste of time, knowing that he's not likely to win New York?
Well, anything that makes your candidate happy is not necessarily.
Is that all this is?
No, he wants to show momentum. I don't think that they are genuinely pledging that they're going to be particularly competitive in New York, but the New York House races are competitive and could well determine, of course, control of that chamber. Governor Hochul was herself in the blue wall states, which is a bit of a funny scenario last week, campaigning for Kamala Harris and saying that they are working to try to deliver those swing seats, because they don't really have much say in the presidential race. So I think New York is safe. I don't think it's really a play there, but there are a lot of House races that are, unclear right now, including in New Jersey as well. So we'll be watching for that. This is trite, Joe. Every time we get asked, who's going to win? What's it going to be? Give me something. And I wish I had more to give, but genuinely, almost everyone you ask on both sides is like, it's just so close right now.
It's remarkable.
4 years ago, the Biden people felt pretty strongly. Mm-hmm. They were up in every poll.
Yep.
They felt pretty strongly. This time around, it's just close.
Not only within the margin, but literally tied in the cases of polls here. Josh, great to see you. Josh Wingrove, the story on the terminal and online. Nice to see Clark Kent in person every now and then here on the program. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. Glad you're with us here. As we pick our way through the swing states, we're going to be doing this a lot over the next 2 weeks. And as we talk about North Carolina today, Donald Trump is there, as I mentioned, and that new Washington Post poll that you might have seen this morning finds Donald Trump in the lead in North Carolina. As we get into a thinner slice here, just looking at the state, 50-47. Again, this is within the margin pretty much anywhere you look, or awfully close when you want to call this a statistical tie. But of course, we had the matter with the lieutenant governor. I think that might be the last time we talked to Professor Bitzer. And he's back with us now. Michael Bitzer, the politics department chair and professor of politics and history at Catawba College in North Carolina. Professor, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg. Been looking forward to talking with you now that we've got a couple of weeks under our belt with regard to the Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson's scandal there that put a lot of noise around North Carolina. And I wonder how you see it now with 2 weeks to go and what appears to be, at least according to the newest polling, a slight lead for Donald Trump.
Well, I think, as you indicated, it is a slight lead, but it is within the margin of error. The way that I describe North Carolina statewide elections, the margin of victory is going to be within the margin of error. And so I think the dynamic of what we have seen over the past month, certainly we started with a September surprise of the Mark Robinson allegations. We then moved into a hurricane hitting the western portion of the state. Nobody was expecting that. So I'm hopeful, but won't be surprised that we will see an October surprise, hopefully not of a magnitude of a hurricane, but we are into the final days and we're well into early voting in this state as well.
I don't know how many surprises North Carolina can take, Professor, but let me ask you about the two things you just mentioned. I'll start with the hurricane. Over the weekend, the call from people living in Asheville was, please do not forget us. Would it behoove the candidates to look back to North Carolina to find out what's going on? There was a rush to get there in a very confusing time of misinformation. What could Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, if not the actual President Joe Biden, do to help?
Well, I think certainly the dynamic of recovery and rebuilding is priority number one for those 25 counties in North Carolina. We're seeing a little bit of depressed turnout in comparison to what we would expect from 4 years ago, but that's primarily in Buncombe County, which is home to Asheville. In fact, a number of the other counties that were hard hit are actually at or slightly ahead of the state averages in terms of turnout so far. But I think that this is certainly a Republican region. It was a 61-39 Republican presidential region. Republicans need their vote to come out of this area that provides about 17% of all the statewide votes. And so certainly if campaigns are going to be focused on that, they need to help with the rebuilding effort, but they also need to focus on, are you safe in your home? Do you have your business back open? Now let's think about participating and voting in this year's election.
Yeah. Well, are people getting around? Is it possible for everyone to get to a polling site?
It is still hard in some regions of the state, particularly north of Asheville in Yancey County. I mean, the devastation in terms of the roads, a lot of mountain roads tend to run along rivers and creeks. And when those rivers and creeks flooded over, they destroyed so much of the infrastructure in western North Carolina. It's going to be a very slow rebuilding process, but people are being able to get supplies into a lot of hard-hit areas, but there may be some communities that are just simply cut off in the back hollers and valleys of the mountain region.
That's a real heartbreaker that we're not talking about enough right now. Professor, on to Mark Robinson. You mentioned the scandal. I think I brought it up first. Now that some weeks have gone by, I was looking at the Raleigh News this morning. Josh Stein has a double-digit lead over Mark Robinson. The lieutenant governor had his whole staff on the campaign quit. Has the state just moved on?
It feels like it. I think that this would be the real surprise of North Carolina's elections. If Josh Stein is able to pull anything more than a 5-point victory margin out, this would be a real landslide in North Carolina. If he's talking about potentially double digits, the effect on the ballot is what I'm going to be very interested in. North Carolina has a long history of split ticket voters, but that part of the electorate has truly collapsed to where it's typically less than 5% of the electorate. If we're talking about a major blowout at the gubernatorial level, does that have an impact at the top of the ticket and down the ballot, particularly in some very competitive Council of State executive statewide offices?
And this is unquantifiable, right, Professor? This is what you do for a living, but there's so much noise. How could you possibly project? Yet everyone you saw over the weekend asked you who you thought was going to win the race, right?
They did, and I would take your jump ball metaphor and make it even simpler. Coin toss. Flip a coin. Heads for Harris, tails for Trump. You're probably about as great of a predictive model as anything that we can put together at this point.
That is something. Of course, the polls, as I mentioned, show a slight lead in North Carolina, but statistically close. And when you add all the noise that you mentioned, it does make you wonder. When you see Donald Trump coming back down today, as I mentioned, he's in Greenville, North Carolina. Does the in-person presence, does showing up matter at this point?
Oh, I think it certainly does. I think it appeals to the base voters for each political party. They need to fight on the ground, and candidate visits like this really helps to mobilize and energize voters. I believe Walz will be here. I believe Harris will be returning as well. So this is really a state where the true battle for victory statewide is literally fought on the ground. We are completely inundated with campaign commercials, but that really doesn't move a whole lot of people. It's about energizing and mobilizing your base to show up.
Yeah, you must love watching TV right now, Professor. So let's talk about showing up. In our remaining moment, I want to look at the early voting that's happening in North Carolina because it's important. More people turned out in North Carolina to cast ballots on the first day of early voting this year than in 2020. Preliminary data shows a record 353,000 people, even more, cast ballots at more than 400 early voting sites statewide when this began Thursday. Professor, who does that favor?
I think right now it is, again, a kind of, we're not sure how to read these tea leaves because as of today, we've got over 1 million early votes cast, and the partisan registration breakdown is fairly even between registered Democrats and registered Republicans. Back 4 years ago, it was a slight Democratic advantage. So how this plays out, and particularly the increase of the unaffiliated voter in this state, yet again, we're trying to decipher the tea leaves, and I'm not sure we can read that much into it with only 4 days out of 17 days of early voting.
The unaffiliated voter, what an idea. It's like looking for Sasquatch out in the wild, Professor. Have you met any of these rare people in this campaign?
Well, I've met registered unaffiliateds, but true registered independent voters, politically independent, they are very few in this very polarized state. An
endangered species. We'll keep our eyes out for Sasquatch with help from the professor with the bow tie. It's great to see you, Michael Bitzer. Come back and talk to us again before we actually close this thing down on Election Day. One way or the other, is it a jump ball or a flip coin? Take your pick, according to the professor. We'll have a lot more ahead on the fastest show in politics.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
As we unpack a wild weekend on the campaign trail, Kailey, a lot of things said by Donald Trump that I can't repeat as we prepare to bring in Mick Mulvaney. Which brings us back to campaigns past. The fact of the matter is, the latest polling out from Washington Post and the Schar School find this is a truly tied race. A survey of the swing states shows 47 to 47 among likely voters, 49 Harris, 48 Trump, still a statistical tie no matter where you look. So arguably, both campaigns are doing everything right. We heard from Kamala Harris over the weekend in an interview with Al Sharpton, her reaction to Donald Trump using an expletive to refer to her, describing her as he did, questioning her running mate's manhood and her husband's extramarital affair in a prior marriage. She was asked to respond. Here she is.
What you see in my opponent, a former president of the United States, really is, it demeans the office. And I have said, and I'm very clear about this, Donald Trump should never again stand behind the seal of the President of the United States. He has not earned the right. He's not earned the right. And that's why he's going to lose.
Although, as we know, it is not guaranteed that he's going to lose this election. As Joe mentioned, we're still in a statistical tie. This thing is a dead heat. So for more on these final 15 days of the race, we turn to Mick Mulvaney, former acting chief of staff in the Trump White House, former director of the OMB, former co-founder of the House Freedom Caucus, congressman from South Carolina. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. Mick, as we're in the home stretch here, it does seem that Kamala Harris has narrowed what her closing argument is going to be, that Donald Trump is unfit to serve as president again. Are you getting a clear closing message from Donald Trump? Is it demeaning the vice president, talking about Arnold Palmer? What exactly is he trying to tell undecided voters here?
Yeah, Kailey, I'm not sure that's the right way to look at it. Here, let me say why I say that. This is not an ordinary election where they're out trying to find, the candidates are out trying to find the last few undecided voters. Keep in mind what Kamala Harris just said in that interview doesn't move an independent voter. Tell me an independent voter who's undecided right now. They know all that stuff about Donald Trump, and they're still undecided for some reason. Donald Trump going into a McDonald's, I don't think, helps sort of get independent or undecided voters. I think this is a turnout election. You're not going to hear, for that reason, a traditional closing argument. I think they're out there trying to make sure their people show up. If Kamala Harris was asked that, is really trying to reach out to independent voters with her comments, she'd say something about herself and what she's going to do. Donald Trump might be talking about what he wants to do, and neither of them are talking about that. So it's a fair question. It's a typical question to ask. I'm just not sure. This is sort of a square peg, round hole sort of election. So looking at it, like we've looked at past elections, might not be the best way to look at it.
I get you, Mick, although when you look at the past, you knew Donald Trump in the campaign in 2016. You knew him in the White House. And so we're seeing Donald Trump in action, right? I mean, what would be different this time? What you see is what you get. And if he's reelected, it's going to feel a lot like it did last time. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're probably right. I mean, face it, you're not going to teach a nearly 80-year-old man new tricks, right? That's just not going to happen. Joe, you and I have talked about this before. The couple of times where I tried to give him campaign advice when we were together in the White House, he'd look at me and go, okay, that's interesting. How many campaigns have you won for president? 0. We're going to do it my way. And I have to imagine that's the conversation that's happening inside the Trump campaign right now. He's going to do what has served him so well for his entire life. He won in 2016. He lost in 2020. He looks at this as sort of the rubber match of the 3 set, and he's going to be him here in the last couple of days.
Well, Donald Trump doing as Donald Trump does is one thing, but the campaign is beyond just him. There's also questions if this is ultimately about turnout, about voting or driving his base to actually go out and vote for him, Mick, as you were suggesting. Are you as confident that the ground game is there? If Donald Trump is just doing what he wants to do, what's everybody else supporting his cause doing?
Yeah, I think it's better than 2020, and here's why I say that. I've talked to Mike Whatley a couple times. Mike, former North Carolina party chair, now running the RNC, about say the ground game and the door to door, and he's like, "Look, Mick, it's not going to come out. It's not going to come across as the same as it was in the past." Because, and this is the specific example he gave me on door knocking, which everybody knows you sort of do, at the last couple of weeks to try and drive enthusiasm and get, maybe an occasional swing voter. He's like, look, we're skipping everybody except hard Republican voters. We're if you're an undecided voter, we're probably not knocking on your door. We are going to find our people. That's by design. And sure enough, there's stories out there how that door knocking campaign might not be as strong as other people think it should be. I think both campaigns are looking at this through a very different prism this year. The campaign looks different. It feels different. And again, the proof will obviously be in the pudding. That probably doesn't add much value to say that. But in talking to the folks of the Trump campaign, I think they are going about this in as methodical as a Trump campaign is going to go through something and say, we are going to find our people and make sure they show up. And my guess is, even though I don't have firsthand information, the same thing is going on in the Harris camp.
Kailey asked you about Donald Trump's closing argument. How about Kamala Harris's? The New York Times ran a headline over the weekend. You might have seen, Mick. Trump becomes the star of Harris's closing pitch, which brings us back to the whole, do you vote for someone or do you vote against someone? Is that enough for her to be the next president?
Up until 2016, actually up until 2016, certainly 2020, I would have said that positive energy is always more important than negative energy. People will show up to vote for something much more than they'll vote to show up against something. And Donald Trump changed that. I've said this before. I'll say it again. People yell at me, but this is not a conspiracy theory. Listen, hear me out. No one voted for Joe Biden. People either voted for Donald Trump or against Donald Trump. There's not that many people voting for Kamala Harris. They don't even know who she is. They're voting for Donald Trump or against Donald Trump. He's a turnout machine for Republicans and a turnout machine for Democrats. What's her closing argument? She got asked some really interesting questions over the course of the last 10 days, which is, how would you be different than Joe Biden? And she's given really poor answers to that, in my opinion, by essentially saying, I'm not Joe Biden and I'm not Donald Trump. That's great, but that's counting on that negative energy. If you really want to deliver the message, you tell people who you are. It harkens back, Joe and Kailey, to the interview I think that Ted Kennedy gave back in the 1970s. And I asked him, why are you running for president? And he couldn't give a good answer.
Roger Mudd.
And that was his thing. Roger Mudd, that's exactly right. If she loses, I think history will look back at those questions she got asked in these final weeks when she wasn't able to tell people who she was and instead chose to tell people who she wasn't.
Well, that's if she loses. There's also the question of if she wins or vice versa. If Donald Trump loses or wins, if either candidate is going to accept those results. So if we're just going to litigate this thing for 3 months between Election Day or almost 3 months and Inauguration Day. Mick, what are you bracing for in the aftermath of November 5th? Knowing what we as a country experienced in 2020, are you seeing the seeds sown for that kind of activity to happen again?
Yeah, Kailey, the easy answer is no, I'm not. But that being said, I didn't see January 6th coming either. I never thought my party would be the folks, leading an armed rebellion. I didn't see it coming, and I certainly don't see it coming now. I think the answer to your question depends not only on how close the election is going to be, and there's a chance it's going to be exactly as close as the polls say that it is. But there's also a chance the polls are wrong, and people have been lying to pollsters now for several years, especially when it comes to Donald Trump. How close it is and where it's close. If it's close in a Republican state like Georgia, if it's close in a Democrat state like Pennsylvania, I think those give two different answers in terms of the reaction that the different parties give. I will caution, I encourage people to consider this. Donald Trump got asked a question during his McDonald's impromptu presser. Would he accept the outcome of election? He said, yes, if it's fair. I think most Democrats that have been asked the same question have been giving the same answer. They've asked a whole bunch of House members over the weekend, would you vote to certify Donald Trump? And their answer is, well, if it's a fair election, it depends on if it's a fair election. I think that's the right answer to give. I wouldn't read automatically, wouldn't draw a straight line from those answers into, say, civil unrest. But look, I hope it goes smoothly. I hope there's a clear-cut winner. I hope it's quick. I hope we don't have to wait 5 days for Pennsylvania to count. That's a self-inflicted wound on the nation and inflicted on us by Pennsylvania. And I just hope there is whoever wins gracefully, whoever loses accepts the outcome.
You know, a shade away from what we're talking about here, Mick, you might have seen this paper from Bruce Mehlman that was making the rounds and in some of the tip sheets this morning. It's titled The 9-Week Slog, and it looks at what happens between the election and January 6th. Are you of the mind that this election is decided before January 5th or after?
Oh, I think I hope it's decided before that. I mean, look, we forget. We don't
ballot
like
box or
elections.
Courthouse, I guess is my question, Mick.
Ballot box. Although, I mean, look, in 2000, it went 46 days before we knew who was the president, and the country managed to get through that. But draw some conclusions that maybe that's where the country sort of started to move apart. I don't know. It's a fascinating academic conversation, but look, I'm one of the folks rooting, as I know a lot of folks are, for some clean-cut decisions. Yes, no, Harris, Trump, whatever. I'm obviously rooting for Donald Trump because I'm a Republican, but I'd like to see some very clean elections, some quick decisions, and then whoever loses say, you know what, I fought my best. Let's move on together.
And that's just the presidential race, of course, Mick. There's also the balance of the House and Senate to consider as well. Would you be feeling better right now if you were Mike Johnson or Hakeem Jeffries?
Oh, that's a great question, Kailey. I don't. Listen, you never know, and here's why. So many of those races, especially the close races, are local. And I know that sounds sort of axiomatic and doesn't, not very insightful, but it really is. I remember talking to Kevin McCarthy, before my race in 2010. I didn't know Kevin very well. He's like, well, it looks like it's going to be a nail-biter, because that's what everybody was telling him. But we knew it was different down here. Sometimes the folks who are down in the trenches, in those House races, are going to know more about their race than anybody else. There's folks out there right now, Republicans, who we think are going to win, who are really, really afraid. Conversely, there's some Republicans out there who think, or Democrats who think they're going to win, who probably won't. You just can't. It doesn't filter up like the governor's races do, the Senate races, and certainly the presidential race. So there was going to be half a dozen or so surprises on election night in the House. And I flip a coin. The country is divided. There's just no question about it. It's really, really narrowly divided. And that will be reflected, obviously, in the presidential race, but in those House races as well. My guess is there's 2 or 3 dozen races decided by less than 1 point.
Pretty amazing to see what's happening on the Senate side, too. Before you joined us, Mick, we were talking about these changes, re-ratings by Cook. Pennsylvania Senate goes from leans D to toss-up. Nebraska Senate goes from likely R to leans R. And you wonder how much the ground will be shifting under our feet between now and November 5th with only 2 weeks to go. Mick Mulvaney, thank you so much for joining us, as always, here on Balance of Power. Former congressman, founder of the Freedom Caucus, former acting White House chief of staff.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
I don't know. This whole conversation just brings us back to the fact that no matter what each campaign in which each candidate try, this is still a tied race.
It absolutely is, as they try to vie, not just with media attention and celebrity, but with policy for voters' votes. And of course, we've gotten a litany of policy proposals from each of them. It's Donald Trump's, though, we want to take a close look at now, as there's a new report from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget that looks at the impact of some of these ideas he's put forward, including no tax on Social Security benefits, mass deportation of people not legally in the country, and some other ideas that the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget finds today could increase Social Security's 10-year cash shortfall by $2.3 trillion through 2035. They are bringing up, Joe, by 3 years, their insolvency estimate from the fiscal year 2034 to 2031, just 6 years after the next president takes office, if these policies come to fruition.
So maybe we should be talking about this now. The candidates have not been. The campaigns have pledged to keep their hands off of this, going back to the old Al Gore line about a lockbox. And you wonder if a report like this brings this conversation to the fore. Last time Maya MacGuineas' group came out with numbers, this was on the tax proposals. Both campaigns were asked about it repeatedly in high-profile interview settings. And I dare say she's driving the conversation again.
Yep, and she's joining us now. Maya MacGuineas is with us. She's president, of course, of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. Maya, it's a fascinating report. Can you just walk us through specifically the policy ideas you are looking at here and how they translate to a financially weaker American Social Security system? What is it exactly that would weaken it so much, knowing it was already on a path to insolvency?
Yeah, exactly. So that's right. The discussion about Social Security has been completely backwards, with candidates promising not to fix a program that desperately needs to be fixed. And as we've been analyzing all of the policies of both candidates, we've been well aware of the void of discussion on this important topic. But what caught us by surprise is when we were going through the policies, we did find that former President Trump's policies, many of them would actually contribute, as you said, to a significant deterioration in the program's finances. As you asked specifically, there have been a lot of promises about cutting taxes for certain groups. Cutting those Social Security benefit taxes means that undermines a revenue stream that currently goes into the program. You would lose about $950 billion by not taxing those benefits for seniors for Social Security. Likewise, if you don't tax tips and you don't tax overtime, that's another revenue stream that's going to finance the underfunded program that would no longer exist. Cuts about $900 billion out of the program over the next decade. And then finally, the effects of getting rid of undocumented workers, mass deportation, and tariffs would actually have both potentially inflationary effects on the economy, which means higher COLAs for seniors, because when there's inflation, hurts many people, but seniors have an automatic bump up in their Social Security benefits, and it could reduce wages, both of which would cause further deterioration, we find, of about $400 billion. And so, like you said, this program headed towards insolvency within less than a decade. Current seniors are on track to be getting 23% across the board benefit cuts, which is unconscionable, terrible policy. They need to do something to fix it. And under these policies, we find that those benefit reductions would actually move up to 33% across the board benefit cuts. We need all candidates talking about how to fix the program. We don't need policies to make it worse.
Well, so how do we figure, Maya, you've been in Washington for a minute, how come no one wants to talk about it? This is a hands-off for both campaigns. That goes for Joe Biden back when he was running, and I guess still as president of the United States. This has been in a lockbox since Al Gore talked about it a whole bunch of years ago. Why won't anyone raise their hand knowing how many people this impacts? This would be a good political issue, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's become a pretzel of a narrative where everybody's talking about it backwards, as though protecting the program means doing nothing, when clearly protecting the program means doing something. We can't be saying to today's seniors, the current plan right now is you are heading for a benefit cut of about $16,000 per year when policymakers promise not to do anything to fix the program. But I have been here for a long time. And we do know that, unfortunately, reasonable fiscal policy can be very bad politics. Right now, we have candidates on both sides promising not to fix Social Security, not to touch these programs, and not to raise taxes, both of which are going to have to be part of an overall plan to address the fiscal situation. So good fiscal policy, not always good politics. That's a real problem for the issue. And as long as pandering on this issue and promising not to touch benefits when they actually, benefits or revenues, when they need to be changed to fix the program, is it's doing a huge disservice to seniors. Frankly, I'm surprised the ARP isn't out there saying to everybody, "Where's your plan?
Absolutely.
You need to have a plan to fix this program."
Well, so on the idea of neither candidate having a plan on this specific issue, we do have an understanding, as we were mentioning with Donald Trump, but for Kamala Harris as well, of what some of their other plans are. Do we have a sense of how the vice president's policy proposals would impact Social Security? Are we looking at the same kind of time frame for insolvency, or is she not as debilitating potentially to the program as some of these other ideas?
Yeah, exactly. She fails completely to put out a plan to address the program, but the policies that she does have that would affect the payroll tax or Social Security kind of net out to zero. So it's neutral. It's where the program already is. Let me say over and over again, though, That is unacceptable. You cannot be saying to current retirees and people who are about to retire that they are a part of a program that is headed towards insolvency, and the bosses of those programs, the lawmakers of this country, are promising not to do anything to fix it. They are trying to wait until the last minute. I don't know why anyone thinks that's a good plan. It's going to hurt seniors and taxpayers more. It's going to leave fewer revenues for other important priorities in the budget. It's going to create chaos and uncertainty in a program for retirement where you need certainty. And it's just frankly like we aren't governing well at this point. They are taking the easy way out instead of saying the trustees tell us every single year in their annual report with basic certainty we are going to have to make changes to avoid these across the board benefit cuts. Let's get to it. We've known about it for years and decades. And it's a presidential campaign. That's what leadership is. It's leveling with the country, including about difficult choices that we have to make, and talking about their plan to address it. And we're just not hearing that from any of the presidential candidates.
Well, God knows we like to wait till the last minute on everything around here in Washington,
We
Maya.
do.
I wonder how often in the history of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget have you found that the Republican candidate adds more to debt and deficit than the spending-happy Democrat? Is this a first?
Well, when President Trump ran previously, in our scores, we found that he would add much more to the overall debt.
So not named Trump.
It used to be, prior to those races, actually the candidates were almost exactly equal, like just to tens of billions of difference in how much they would affect the national debt through very different kinds of policies. You'll remember in the past, Republicans tended to cut taxes, Democrats tended to raise spending. You're now seeing a merging of both, where Republicans also raise spending and Democrats also cut taxes. So both candidates' proposals are much, much worse than we've seen in the past. And in this situation, we've certainly seen that President Trump's, with its effect on Social Security and the overall debt, is larger than we're seeing from Vice President Harris. Yeah.
Prepare to hear both candidates forced to respond to this research. Maya, I'm so sorry. We're out of time. Come back and see us soon. Send us what you wanted to say. We'll let the audience know. Maya MacGuineas, Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Of course, she's the president there. And Kailey, this is the first time we're hearing about this, not the last time.
Absolutely. Remember, there's town halls happening for the candidates this week. They could face some tough questions about this. And of course, we'll continue to have full coverage here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Thanks for being with us here on the Monday edition of Balance of Power. Ed McMahon has been dead for 15 years. I just had to check. Can you believe that was 2009? If you don't know Ed McMahon, ask your parents. Because I figure if he was still with us, he could be playing an important role for the Trump campaign right now. Did you see Elon Musk with the big check, the big cardboard check on stage over the weekend? He's giving away $1 million a day. Imagine Ed McMahon with the big check and the balloons knocking on your door. The Publishers Clearinghouse. That was the American dream, wasn't it? A little bit different this time. Did you used to put in for the Publishers Clearinghouse? You get all the magazines thinking you might win some money. Now you register to vote, I guess, or sign a petition. Elon Musk making big news. $1 million a day he's going to give away between now and the election if you sign the petition. People said, wait, that's not legal. Until they read the fine print here. It's basically a sweepstakes. So what keeps, by the way, all the Harris supporters from trying to get $1 million a day? Maybe they don't want to give up their cell phone number. I digress. The fact of the matter is, it's coming down to a jump ball election. As Josh Wingrove put it here earlier, who scores last? And that, of course, means who turns out the voters most. The news today, the polling from the Washington Post is remarkable. It's tied. Not even a statistical tie. It's a tie. He gets 47, she gets 47. And that's a poll of the swing states. Speaking over the weekend on Sunday morning television, one of Kamala Harris's chief surrogates in the swing states, the governor of Wisconsin. Tony Evers talking on ABC This Week about the ground game. Let's listen.
There are people that, frankly, don't follow this on a daily basis. There's people that don't follow the polls. There's people that just don't, they go to work, they got kids at home, they do their job with their kids, they get up the next day. These polls look at a small number. I know it's a science, but at the end of the day, I run into people all the time that just haven't given it a thought. And so we're going to help them.
They're like the three amigos now. Evers, Whitmer, Shapiro. They sat for a three-way interview. They also sat down with Bloomberg, spoke with the aforementioned Josh Wingrove, who hit the trail with all three. It's where we start our conversation with our panel. Let's get them together. Our signature panel is back on this Monday. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors. She, of course, is political science professor at Iona University. Rick is partner at Stone Court Capital. It's great to see both of you. Rick, in the final stages here, welcome back. What are you doing as a campaign manager with 2 weeks left? Early voting is underway, and you need to get people off the couch who maybe have never voted before. It's that close. How do you spend your time?
Yeah, there are really two things that are still moving. One is the schedule, so getting the final tour set and all the activity that goes around that, which is not insignificant. And then secondly, which is actually more important, is pumping every extra dollar you have in to get out the vote and monitoring those and checking them against historical averages or current registration lists. So it's really just pouring over slates of numbers constantly throughout the day and redirecting your efforts to fill vacancies, to make sure that the precincts that matter the most are getting the attention. And so the TV's all bought, the ads are all made, things that people see as a campaign are pretty much done. Highly unlikely there's going to be a killer ad that's produced and put up in the last 2 weeks of the election. So it's all about the ground game and making sure that you're not missing something like Hillary missed the entire state of Michigan in 2016. That may be the biggest historic miss in history, but mostly it's making sure that precincts you're dependent upon are hitting a certain turnout level that you have estimated will give you a victory.
It's pretty fascinating stuff, Jeanne. What Tony Evers said there, these are people that don't follow the polls, right? They don't follow this on a daily basis the way we do. We're weird. We're not normal. He didn't say that. I did. They've got kids at home. They do time with their kids. Jeanne, how do you find them? How do you talk to them in their homes in the next 2 weeks?
Yeah, they have lives, Joe, unlike you. And I just pictured you all weekend, Joe, and you haven't mentioned it to us yet. But watching that McDonald's clip, that was, 55 minutes.
I haven't mentioned it yet.
It's precious. I mean, it's 55 minutes of trolling, and I have to say it was pretty good. How you reach them is just the way that Rick was talking about. And I think that's why getting those governors out on the ground in those blue states, the blue wall, as we call it, is so important. Yeah. One sort of under-discussed aspect of these 7 swing states is 5 of the 7 have Democratic governors. And, there was a long time when, for Democrats, rightly, they bemoaned the fact that many leaders at the state and local level for a long time in the U.S. have been on the Republican side. We're seeing that change. And I think it can't, underestimate how important our local and state officials are in things like the ground game, getting people out to vote, energizing folks. So all of that critically important, which is why, Donald Trump is lately trying to, make up with Kemp, and I guess they have. But that's why you never want to sort of, have a, some kind of riff with those folks on the ground, because they matter an awful lot.
Well, they absolutely do. Rick, does it help to be putting on the McDonald's apron and doing that stunt that Donald Trump did yesterday? By the way, the answer may well be yes. A lot of people ran images of him behind the fryolator and handing out bags of food to people in their cars. But, of course, we know they closed the restaurant that day, and he was actually doing the job for less than 5 minutes.
Yeah, I thought the imagery was terrific. There were a lot of ups and downs with his campaign over the weekend, but it wasn't because he went to the McDonald's. One, it's authentic, right? The guy eats more McDonald's than probably any other elected official in history. So he actually knows the routine pretty well, and it wouldn't surprise me it's not his first time behind the counter at a McDonald's. The reality is the pictures are worth much more than the event itself. And so kudos to the campaign for putting him in a place, really well done. Had the whole apron going, had the fry in his hand. And they got him out of there without a whole lot of grease on his fingers and too many Big Macs getting eaten. So that was a good weekend shot for them. And this is one thing they've always done pretty well, is put him, Donald Trump, in a humanizing location. It's separate from the big rallies that we're all used to. They're pretty good at these kind of OTAs, off the record type events.
So people watching on YouTube, you're actually seeing Donald Trump in action behind the fry-olator. He did that for 5 minutes, and he spent about 15 minutes at the drive-thru. All right, Jeannie, you pulled me into this because I don't like to talk about it. No one ordered. They didn't get to order? That's just very funny to me. They said they were pre-selected people. They pull up, and these are Trump supporters, I guess, pre-selected by the Secret Service, pull up to the window, and he gives you a bag of something. You're not really sure what's in it. But so Kamala Harris has been invited to do the same, I'm told, or I read, by this franchise owner, Jeanne. And part of the point here is Donald Trump doesn't believe Kamala Harris worked at a McDonald's. He said this again to the reporters who were there, that he worked 15 minutes more than Kamala Harris did. Does she need to produce a photograph or something here? She says she worked at a McDonald's in Alameda, California in 1983 during the summer, freshman year, Howard University. I spent a summer working in the Frito-Lay shipping department, Jeannie. My hair still smells like grease. I don't have a photograph. I actually went back to look. I thought, is it possible? This is before cell phones. Is it entirely possible that no such a photo exists? Number one, and should she take the invite and go to McDonald's?
Well, Joe, I have to agree with you. The kids today can't believe it. But like when I worked at Friendly's back in the day, and you remember Friendly's New England?
Yes.
And, I worked at several Friendly's, in fact. And, I don't have any photographs of me in that uniform. And so she may not have photographs. She does have friends who attest to the fact she worked there. I think she can very well go to the McDonald's. But I think what the campaign on the Kamala Harris side is trying to do is trying to point to Donald Trump and what they describe as unhinged behavior. And over the weekend and over the last week, he has given them a lot to work with. And, one of the things we've talked about a long time now for this election is whoever this election is about and whoever this election is a referendum on may very well lose. And Donald Trump, since he can't keep his focus on, say, Kamala Harris's, 2019 policy prescriptions or policies themselves, keeps saying things, and we heard a bevy of them over the weekend, that do make him look unfit to be president. And so that's what they are focusing on as we move to this closing. And of course, they're also bringing out Republicans who say, I don't agree with Kamala Harris on any issue, but I agree with her on this. The man who's talking about Arnold Palmer in this way cannot be president of the United States. And that is an important closing point, because some of the data shows for independents, that does move the needle a bit.
Yeah, I don't even know what to say about that one. And we're going to spend a little more time on some of the language that was used over the weekend with our panel in the next hour. By the way, Friendly's is still around, Jeannie. That looks like they've got a lot of them left. And so is, to my just learning now, the Publishers Clearinghouse. It's pch.com. Who knows? These things never go away. Rick, you talked about authenticity. Donald Trump, not necessarily in the cosplay at McDonald's, but wearing the apron with credibility. Would Kamala Harris draw the same image and response from you if she took them up on their invite?
I don't know. I mean, you hate to do the copycat thing. I honestly think it would be much more effective, showing up in Philadelphia, grabbing a steak and cheese. I think these are the things that would suit her much better and be in a place that's, more likely to make her seem like every person, right? Which is what Donald Trump is trying to accomplish. I mean, the reality is authenticity does matter. And so if she's been on defense every time he, lies about her record, she tries to correct the record. And I applaud her for doing that. But as a result, she literally has spent almost every day on defense. And at some point in time, you got to go on offense and start creating your own record. And that would include, going after Donald Trump as a, I don't know, pretender to the Burger King, right? I mean, he's not somebody who anybody visualizes eats, McDonald's every day, even though he probably does.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it brings us to the New York Times headline from over the weekend. You might have noticed Playbook grabbed a screen grab of it for a reason. And we're going to get into this with our panel in the next hour. Trump becomes the star of Harris's closing pitch. That's what Rick's talking about. And you wonder if that might turn around again between now and November 5th. Indeed, fond memories of the light blue cotton candy soda for producer James at Friendly's. I'll tell you what, the memories will pull him back here. Cece says, Kamala Harris, go to Angelo's. Maybe we talk a little bit about the restaurants here coming up off the air, guys. We still have 2 weeks to fill. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.